thing. So thank you again for listening to the Trainer podcast, in which I'm trying to bridge the gap between science and practice for trainers in law enforcement, for trainers in the military, instructors, and recently the last years in emergency medicine. And today I have my guest Duane Wolfe, if I'm spelling it correctly.
Yes.
Or pronouncing it correctly. As always, my English, it's going better, but sometimes I cannot find the right words. So I had your biography from the police one, so maybe if it's not right, so I will, for the listeners. You served as a patrolman, sergeant, SRT, use of force and violence instructor. You were a full-time law enforcement instructor at Alexandria Technical and Community College in Alexandria, Minnesota for 28 years. That's a long time.
Yes.
And you also have a Bachelor of Science degree in Criminal Justice and a Master's degree in Education. So it's all about training and education. It's looks
Yes.
like, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
And well, why is being a police instructor the most beautiful job there is?
Well, you have an important job being a police officer, and it's your job to make them the best that they can be, the most efficient, the most effective, the most ethical, the most moral as they can be, to go out and do an incredibly difficult job dealing with
Yeah,
incredibly difficult situations on a daily basis.
yeah. How did you become involved in the teaching part?
Well, in Minnesota, you're required to have a minimum of a 2-year degree in order to be a police officer. So every state in the United States has slightly different requirements.
Hmm.
So for Minnesota, you have one of two options when you go through the training. You can either attend a 2-year institute that has both the academic learning and the hands-on learning combined, or you go to a university or college that will provide you with the academic learning, and then you go to what we call skills training, which right now runs about 8 weeks, and attend that on your own. So I attended a 4-year college, and I went to Alexandria Technical College to attend my skills training.
Hmm.
While I was there, I've always been involved in the martial arts. I've been a karate instructor for a very long time. So training has always held a deep interest to me. While I was there, the DT instructor there became one of my mentors
Hmm.
for many, many years, and eventually ended up working with him. And I decided at that time that someday, after I put in 10, 15, 20 years, if there was a job opening, that I would apply for it. Okay, well, lo and behold, at 7 years after being a patrol officer, I got the phone call asking me if I wanted to come teach. So I had to make a decision as to whether or not I wanted to be a full-time police officer and a part-time trainer, or a full-time trainer and a part-time police officer. And because the training has always held that place in my heart,
Yeah.
I decided to go and teach at the college. So our job for the 2-year students, as well as our summer students who come in, was teaching primarily the hands-on skills. So I primarily served as the firearms instructor for over 20 years. I taught a class on how to respond to crimes in progress, as well as a wide variety of other classes that I taught over those 28 years. So that ability to teach full time, which is not something most police trainers get to do because they're rotating out of their normal job as a police officer into a training academy for short periods of time, uh, has given me probably more time teaching in 28 years than most training officers would have in 28 years.
Hmm.
So that being my full-time job, it's given me a lot of opportunities. Number one, because I'm not working the street, it gives me the opportunity to spend more time doing research and to go to additional training uh, in order to try and improve what I teach and how we teach it.
Great. Well, so many questions pop up in my head, but I have to go to the least important maybe for some people. But I'm doing karate all my life also. What style of karate and are you still practicing?
I'm still practicing. It's a Okinawan style called Shorin-ryu Matsumura Kempo.
Ah, great. I studied Okinawa Goju-ryu karate from
Oh,
the Miyagi and then
yep,
Higona
yep,
line.
yep.
Ah, okay, great.
Yes.
And you did it, and for how long did you do you practice this?
I started when I was 17, so I'm getting close to, well, I can't do the math. It's pretty high there.
Yeah,
I've been doing it for a couple of weeks. Let's
yeah.
just put it to you that way.
Oh, great. And did your how do you call it? Did your philosophy of karate also changed when becoming a police instructor? For example, nowadays I'm the coordinator of the teachers, karate teachers,
Okay.
and I cannot sit on my hands if I see some like somebody attacks with Oitsuki and then he gets like a shuto in his neck and a knee and a nukite and so on, and then my police mind comes up like proportional and well, how do you deal with that?
Well, being a martial artist and being a police trainer is a dichotomy.
Yeah.
Um, you have what you learn in the dojo, and then you have what you learn in order to do police work and have a reasonable use of force.
Yeah.
Uh, so there's always that separation between the two, and you have to segment that and remember what it is you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do based upon the totality of the situation and circumstances. The One of the biggest things for me was you're training in the dojo, which is a artificial environment, and then you become a police officer where violence is real. It isn't practiced, it isn't staged. You're not working with someone who's on your side, wants to help you learn. So the preparation that I had for the martial arts was good. It prepared me well, and using what I learned has kept me safe on any number of occasions. Uh, but by the same token, the reality of being in a confrontation with someone who wants to hurt you or that you have to take into custody is very interesting and very different, let's say.
Yeah.
So, in order to have a good outcome on the street, you have to have realistic training. Unfortunately, my karate instructor was a former Green Beret who served in Vietnam. He had a very realistic approach
Mm.
to training. So I wouldn't say that I had a whole lot of difficulty dealing with the physical aspect of it. But it makes for an interesting comparison because one of the things that I learned when I became a trainer, as most trainers like to do, is they like to teach what they know and what they like.
Yes.
All
Yeah.
right. So I'm a
Yeah.
karate guy. So how do I solve problems? By kicking and punching.
Yeah.
All right. Uh, in law enforcement, that isn't necessarily going to work all the time. It may not be the best solution. Um, my martial arts functioned to that point, but by the same token, uh, not everybody that I trained was going to attain the level that I had through constant practice. So one of the things that I always tell people is martial arts were great for martial artists,
Mm.
but martial arts don't work well for police officers. What we have to teach is the principles that can be easily understood and easily applied in order for them to be effective for police officers. Now, for instance, right now in the United States, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu
Yeah.
is very popular.
Yeah.
It's also proven very, very functional for police officers. The key concept here is we can't teach BJJ to officers. We have to teach the principles. And my understanding is for some styles of BJJ, it may take 10 years to get your black belt. The average police officer is not going to put in the time, the effort, and the energy, let alone daily practice, in order to attain that level of proficiency. So we have to take those concepts, meld them down, teach them the basic principles that will help them be more successful in those situations where they may be forced to use force.
And here in the Netherlands, there is a kind of standardized police curriculum. It's called arrest and control techniques, and it's the trainers learn this in their education. And if you want to become a police trainer, well, you have to go to school, so to speak, for minimal a year, but mostly a year and a half, and so on. So there's a kind of standardized curriculum. Although, of course, if my hobby is jiu-jitsu, most likely I will do more of that. But how is that in the States? I mean, is there a standardized curriculum, or can it be everything?
Well, if I understand how things work in the Netherlands, basically the police force is nationalized and everybody
Yeah,
has standardized training. Okay. In the
correct.
United
Yeah,
States, it varies from state to state. So every state is different, which makes things interesting.
yeah,
I know states that require officers to go through an instructor course before they can teach. That specific state probably has very established objectives and curriculum, how what's going to be taught for how long, etc. In the state where I work at, we don't do that. The course objectives are listed. It doesn't tell you specifically what method to teach a technique. For instance, you may have companies like Controlled Force or PPCT. That isn't specified. So the trainer can pick what they want. And what happens too often is that instructors, like I did, pick the things that they like
yeah,
and attempt to teach that to police officers. So
mhm,
when you have large agencies, the use of force program for in-service training changes based on who the instructor is and what their likes and dislikes are. The same thing in our academies. A lot of our academies don't have full-time instructors like myself. They hire adjunct instructors. So that instructor comes in and teaches the system they like, the system they know, which leads to a couple of problems. Number one, the department that they go to may utilize a different program. So they're not consistent in their training with what the other officers in the department are doing. So they have to get brought up to speed on that. And the other problem is when you teach what you like, where's our proof that what we're teaching is the best method?
yeah. So before I want to double click on how to become a police instructor in the USA. I would love to hear one time what did you learn in martial arts that is still valuable in like let's say in law enforcement. What are the things we learned? I'm a martial arts practitioner for all my life, and I think I have learned some things, but I have to admit it when I'm becoming older, I see more concepts being so true. Yeah.
That's a big question. Probably the biggest takeaway for me from my martial arts was uh, not all karate styles teach grappling, wrist locks, arm bars, throws. Tuite. Uh, my Okinawan instructor was very much into teaching us tuite. His philosophy was if we start teaching it to you at a white belt, by the time you get to black belt, you should actually be able to use it.
Yeah.
So we did a lot of drilling because obviously it's a very difficult uh, method of doing things. It takes a great deal of practice in order for it to be effective uh, when you're dealing with someone who's not being cooperative in the dojo. The other biggest thing from the martial arts is probably the sense of calm, a sense of acceptance of physical confrontation, because altogether, too often nowadays, we have people coming in who want to be police officers who have never been in a physical altercation in their life. Uh, Having trained in a dojo uh, with a lot of fighting, that was not a big, uh, didn't have a big effect on me because I was used to it.
Yeah. Well, for me, I recently rediscovered Japanese concepts like Zanshin, Fudoshin, and I thought these are great concepts. And of course, you have modern Western sport psychology, etc. But these are really sound concepts.
Yes, yes, they are.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and if you want to become a police instructor, I recently Chris Butler told me he didn't like the term instructor or trainer anymore. So and well, let's talk about police trainer, police educator, whatever. If you want to become a police trainer, what is required? How do you come there in the States?
Well, like I said, in some states it would require that you go through go through a specific training.
Yeah,
There isn't anybody in the United States requiring instructors to go through a year of training. Uh, Around here, it would be if you want to be a firearms instructor, you would probably go to a week or a 2 week long course.
yeah,
Unfortunately, most of those classes have very little to do with instruction, and it's mostly about making you a better shooter. I can tell you that when I went to firearms instructor school and I came back, I had a piece of paper that said I was a firearms instructor, and by golly, I knew everything there was to know about instructing people in firearms until students started having problems and starting asking me questions, and I didn't have the biggest idea what the answers
yeah,
were because I hadn't learned it. So that took time in order to get to that level of proficiency,
yeah,
which means making a lot of mistakes, sometimes telling people what I thought was right, only to find out later on it was incorrect. Uh, so one of the things that I talk about with trainers is understand that part of the journey of being a trainer is the learning process, and that
mhm,
during that learning process you will make mistakes, and you have to forgive yourself for those mistakes because we do the best we can with what we have at the time. Your job is to gather as much information, as much knowledge in order to increase your abilities to train your students better. And once you've done that, uh, then you get better and your
yeah,
students get better. Um, so as far as that, that's something I really stress with instructors.
yeah.
Um, in here in Minnesota, you can become an instructor. You go to a class, you get a certificate. If your department decides to put you on as a instructor in that particular area or whatever class you went to, then you're good to go.
So,
So it's
so
relatively short periods.
of course, you have to be a police officer then, eh?
You can actually train police officers for what we call post credits, which is a peace officer standards and training, which is required to have a certain number of credits every 3 years in this state. And you don't necessarily have to be a police officer.
Hmm.
I know of martial artists who in the past have taught defensive tactics classes
Ah,
for
like
post
that.
credit. Um,
Ah,
so, and with that, you have to be cautious of what's being taught, and not every
yeah,
martial artist understands use of force, let
yeah.
alone how cops operate, let alone the type of the level of expertise of the people that we teach.
Okay, so here in the Netherlands, for your insight, we have like when I was an instructor, we had a 2 year course, 2 year course. Nowadays it's a little bit shorter, but you become it's called IBT, IBT, integral. You become basically a police trainer. You do the firearms, you do the defensive tactics, you do the procedures, you do the law. So it's already based upon the integration. So I, as an instructor, uh, it is required that I can do all those things and not being only a firearms. 20 years ago, it was like that. So we had a firearms guy, we had a sports guy, we had a DT guy, but now every instructor has all those things. And then you have to do, you have to become certified for that. And it's a lot about the teaching also. It's not only about. I think in the Netherlands it's maybe the other way around. Sometimes there is so much teaching, sometimes a little bit too less. How do you call it? Your own skill training. But
Right.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, I wish that we were there and we could do that. Basically, we have a problem in the United States with silo training,
yeah,
where the DT instructor teaches whether or not they integrate things. For instance, in the academy, in most academies, it will be you have your days of taser, you have your days of baton, you have your days of OC spray, you have your days of hands-on training, and there's not a whole lot of mixing and matching in order to break down those silos. Um, One of the things that I did in one of my classes, which wasn't a DT class, is once I knew they were done in DT with all of their skills, I would bring them in and I would teach them transition drills from one tool to the other, up and down for a level of force based on the distance, whether or not you had a failure of whatever tool it was you're using. Because if I hadn't done that, it wouldn't have gotten done. And I think that if there's an area that's overlooked, at least in the United States, uh, it's that's transitioning. Paul Taylor did a study not too long ago
Yeah,
where
sorry.
he was measuring the time it took officers to transition from a taser to a handgun or a handgun to a taser. And 70% of the officers that he tested had never practiced any type of transitions. Those who had had very few repetitions. As a result, what you saw was that the officers transitioning from taser to handgun were much faster than from handgun to taser because 80% of the time, the officers just dropped a taser and went to the gun. Now, that is a way of transitioning. However, we do have possibilities of bad outcomes by dropping one of our tools on the ground. So that was an invented on the moment technique in order to deal with the situation, which may or may not be the best choice, depending on the totality of the situation and circumstances. So the the fact that in the Netherlands you get to do that uh, is incredible. By the same token, I don't know of any department that would be willing to let go one of their officers go from the department for a year to 2 years
Yeah,
for training. They can't afford it, especially with the shortage of police officers that we
yeah.
have now.
But with this problem of silo and block training, so how do you call it? There is so much research from for science from everywhere that is not a good approach. Do you think there comes a time when departments and the US police, whatever, are going to say we have to make this move, or is it not realistic, practical?
I think it's practical, but I don't think it's going to happen quickly. Obviously, right now, with all the things that are going on in the United States and have gone in the United States involving police and use of force, we're looking for reforming with the idea that reform is changing things to make things better. One of the most common problems is the science, the research isn't brought into the training.
Mm,
Why? The average police officer isn't required to do any research on
mm,
what regarding the areas that they teach. The average police officer isn't the least bit interested in what they're being taught, whether or not it's been peer reviewed and published. Um, the problem is most trainers are not aware of the research. In my classes, when I teach at ILETA, I've asked for years how many people in here are familiar with force science. Now, 10 years ago, very few hands went up. Today, most hands would go up in the class.
mm.
Well, I saw that as a change. And a couple of years ago, after I taught my first class, I thought that was interesting. So when I asked the same question in the second class and I got the same response, I thought to myself, okay, how many of you are reading the newsletter and reading the research? Well, the number of hands dropped
Mm,
dramatically. And then I asked, how many of you are taking that research and applying it in your training? And there's usually only one or two people in a class with their hands raised. Now, this is an organization called the International Law Enforcement Trainers and
yeah,
Educators Association. Among the best trainers in the country are attending this conference in order to become better, and yet they don't have access to the research. So one of the things that ILETA has asked me to do is they've asked me to start taking research and writing it up in a manner where police trainers can look at it easily, find out what the research says, and then look at recommendations on how to apply it. Because we both know, having read research, I don't have a PhD. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm reading it, I get confused.
so
I've on more than one occasion jumped to the wrong conclusion based number one on my biases, and sometimes I wasn't reading quite as well as I should. So it's getting the information out is difficult.
yeah,
I think right now, one of the best methods of getting it out to trainers is what we're doing here.
yeah,
You and I talking. I have, since I found your uh, channel, I have been posting your videos.
yeah,
Chris Butler is doing an excellent job.
yeah,
Brian Willis does
yeah,
an excellent job. And if officers could get out there and take the time to sit down and listen to the research and listen to what it tells us and what we can do to improve our training, that would make a big step.
Yeah.
So besides applying the research, which is absolutely critical, we also have to come up with the best teaching methods.
Yeah.
Now, the concepts of doing away with silo, interleaving versus block training, um, desired difficulty, effortful retrieval, all of those are relatively new concepts to me, having learned them in the last 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
In the 2 years since I retired, I've had a lot more time to sit down and read research. When you're a police officer and you're working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, there's not a whole lot of time to sit down and do that. Well, I've got a lot more leisure time. So I've had that opportunity. And I wish that I could go back in time and take those things that I've learned in the last 2 years and go back and apply them
Yeah.
to make my students better. By the same token, having learned those things, my partner and I taught a firearms class together for 20 years. We were employing those concepts not because we knew what we were doing, but because we were constantly changing things to see if we could get a better effect. We never taught a class the same time or the same way 2 times in a row. I was
Mm.
always looking at the research and making little tweaks of how we said it, when we did it, how we did it, in order to see if there would be an improvement.
Yeah.
Now, the last class that I taught at ILETA was a class called Shooting with Science. And what we were able to achieve in our class, in our program, was this, is depending on the qualification standard, and again, they vary from state to state. And we look at the lower hit ratios that police officers have. Well, if you take a look at the qualification rates, you'll find that the times for shooting are extremely generous. And sometimes the scoring area is the entire silhouette. And the rating is you got to hit 70%, which means if you fire 50 rounds, which would be a normal qual, you have to have 35 bullet holes somewhere on that target. Now, and the time that you're able to do that in is incredibly long. Well, when we take an officer who's been trained like that and you place them under stress, we all know that stress is going to affect accuracy, let alone movement and cover and adrenaline. We should be surprised that we actually have the hit ratios that we have, I think. What we did in our program was we changed it to 100% qualification. In other words, all of your rounds have to be on target. You can't miss 15 rounds. Along with that, we also added in a scoring. We took the target and we changed it. So instead of having center mass, where if I draw a line from my shoulder to my hip and from my shoulder to hip where bisects, is center mass, which is below the solar plexus, which is not the most effective place to place a round to stop a fight. We changed the target to be more anatomically correct and adjusted the scoring to reflect that. We were able to achieve in the last 3 out of 4 classes a 100% qualification rate with all of our students.
Mm.
And I attribute that to interleaving, effortful retrieval, desirable difficulty. And the thing that for me made the biggest difference, where we were normally at 98 to 99%, those last 3 out of 4 classes, we went to 100. And what we did at that point is we introduced the concept of the quiet eye.
Mm.
And I'd seen the research before, and I looked at it and said, well, how do we employ that? Well, I found a video online put out by a Navy SEAL. It's called Shoot Like a Navy SEAL Front Sight Focus. And in order to teach front sight focus, he has a number of slides, and each one of the slides is an optical illusion. All right. So we have foveal vision. All right. And when I fix my eye on a single point, that's the point 3 to 5 degrees that's in focus. Everything else is out of focus. And because my eyes are constantly scanning, if I'm looking at these specific diagrams, drawings, one of them is like a bunch of spirals. And if you're looking at it, all the spirals move. So they're optical illusions. One is a circle of a bunch of pink dots, where if you stare at the center, eventually those dots will disappear. Would he use those to say, okay, look here, and he'd impose a front sight on top of it. So when the students, and we couldn't do this in class because it'd be up on the PowerPoint. We asked the students to do it on their own. Is when you focus on that front sight, then the spirals stop moving, the pink dots disappear, the one with the lines and the dots disappears. So now you know you've established a quiet eye on the tip of that front sight. I literally took those, screenshotted them, and stuck them on the wall of the range so the students could practice quiet eye. And I literally had students come up to me and say, you know what, I've been shooting for years, and now I finally know what I'm supposed to be looking at.
Great.
Because
Can you, for listeners who don't know about a quiet eye, can you explain what it means? What,
okay, so Dr. Victor's utilizing eye scanning devices determined that elite performers, when they're looking, when they're performing a task, will look at a specific point longer than other less proficient people will do. So holding that gaze for 2/10 of a second would suggest that the eye settled on that spot. And their performance was determined by where they looked. And by utilizing that idea, they improved performance by teaching the quiet eye technique to other people, whether it's golf or basketball. And then I finally found this for firearms, so I was able to translate to the students. Because as a firearms instructor, you can tell the student to look at the front sight, and you'll ask them, "Are you looking at the front sight?" They go, "Uh-huh," and you have no way of monitoring other than the results downrange. And sometimes it's not because they're not looking at the front sight; it's other things as to why they're not hitting where they're supposed to be aiming at. But this gave them that tool, and I honestly believe that introduction of the quiet eye, utilizing that research, made a significant difference. Now, that's for sighted fire. The other study that Dr. Vickers and Dr. Lewinsky did in Ireland some years back is they compared novice shooters to expert shooters. And they found in a simulation that the officers who were experienced on a special squad is they didn't focus on the front sight, they focused on the threat. The officers who were less experienced, who focused on the front sight, were slower to respond to the person turning with a gun. They made more mistakes shooting people armed with cell phones versus guns, where the advanced group who maintain their visual focus on the threat, because you can't focus your eye on more than one focal plane at a time, were much faster to respond to the threat, were much more accurate to respond to the threat, and made fewer mistakes. And prior to that,
yeah. Go
we
ahead.
had incorporated a method of teaching the students what we call alternate sight method. So understanding that when vasoconstriction kicks in, if it kicks in, because there's no physiological effect of stress. It's 100% of the time with 100% of the people, 100% of the time. If vasoconstriction kicks in, the blood goes away from the iliac muscles in the eyes, they relax and they go into far vision, which means picking up the front sight can be difficult. So understanding target, or excuse me, threat focus, looking at something that's trying to kill me, understanding if I'm looking there, I can't see my front sight. I took a concept that I learned from other instructors, and we taught the students, once we tape up the back, we'd tape up the rear sight so they couldn't use it. We taught them to use the back of the slide as their aiming point. They've got enough repetitions where they can bring it up. And this is a close distance. This is generally 5 yards and in, where the majority of police officers in the United States are killed. So we want to do something to pick up the speed. By utilizing that concept, we saw a marked improvement in their abilities when we put them out in simulations in close proximity. The instructors out in that class could literally tell, based on the training cycle, those who'd had alternate sight picture training before they came out and those who hadn't, because of the speed and the accuracy at which the student shot at.
And is
So,
the threat vision, is that still a kind of quiet eye, or is it external
yes,
focus? Yeah,
a threat focused would be a quiet eye because you're intently staring at that thing that's trying to seriously hurt you or somebody else.
yeah.
So yes, and that's an excellent point. Thanks for bringing that out. So it's taking that understanding. And one of the things that I see, well, as we both see, in training is all too often those impacts of stress, which are the human factors, are ignored. Um, I know people will argue that, there's no reason you can't see your front sight in a gunfight. Okay, except we have all kinds of studies that show, for instance, they took 100 police recruits and they put them into force on force scenarios, and they asked, how many of you looked at your front sight? And 98 of them said, I didn't. And two of them said they did. And then they showed them the gun, and the gun didn't have a front sight. Uh, so we have to understand what happens, and we have to train people for the level of stress they're going to be operating under. We can have martial arts experts, we can have firearms experts come in and teach us, but just because it works for them in the arena that they work in, which is not law enforcement, which is not life and death, which is not real confrontations, doesn't mean it's going to translate well out on the street. And that's one of the things that we have to constantly evaluate and constantly look at in order to improve our training, to improve the results with the people that we train.
Great. Before we move on to the second part, to the, let's call it ODA-proof law enforcement training, two questions left with regard to training. The first one is, did police training change in your long career? And the second one is, if you are a police instructor nowadays, what are some great books or articles or videos to watch or read?
Well, the changes are occurring. The changes are going to continue to occur, but like any large beast or organization, especially when you have each state split up, the change in training is going to be fast some places and slow other places. I know there are agencies out there around the country who are doing training the way it should be done, utilizing the best teaching methods, taking into account the research. But there's more agencies out there that aren't. So the big push for me on a personal level is to get that information out to as many trainers as I can in as easily digestible form as possible. So it's going to take time. There's always going to be those that lag behind because we don't have a national force. We've got states, and then it's broken up by departments. And depending on the state, for instance, in Minnesota, every department gets to do what they want. So getting the word out to those trainers who don't belong to an organization like ILETA, where that information was available to them, is going to take longer. And we're going to continue to have the same problems that we're seeing reoccur because people just don't know any better. And that's the way it's going to be, I guess. For a while. Your second question was what?
The second question was about books, great books, but maybe I have other question. You told me you have more time now.
Yes.
And you're great in writing.
Yeah.
What the follow-up question is, when do you publish a book with easily digestible experience about teaching?
You're not the first person to ask me that question, and my answer is I haven't really sat down and set my mind to doing it. That's all I can say.
Okay, so your book is is maybe
it's up here.
It's in the head, but are there some
whether or not it ever comes? Oh, we'll see.
Before your book is out, what are other resources you find really inspiring and good?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, right now, because we live in a technological world, the podcasts that you're putting out, that Chris Butler's putting out, that Brian Willis are putting out, I think are an absolute outstanding source of information. Now, Brian's site is subscription.
Yeah.
But he has close to, if not over 450 interviews.
Incredible.
And I will tell you that I belonged to Brian's group for many, many years, and I have not looked at most of them because I've only been retired for 2 years.
Yeah.
That is a wealth of information and knowledge
Unbelievable. Yeah.
sitting there waiting to be tapped. If nothing else, if you just go in and look at your areas of expertise and interest.
Yeah.
You and Chris Butler are doing a fantastic job of getting the current research out and making it available. Any number of books. If you want to learn about the quiet eye, Dr. Victor's has a book on the quiet eye. I don't remember the name of the title. If you want to learn about decision making, I think it's Dr. Lee and Dr. Schmidt have a book on that. And they are designed for user level. They're not over the top of your head. They're not designed for doctors. So those would be books that you want to take a look at. And I mean, there's so many off the top of my head. I can't think of them. I can't think of them all right now. I'm drawing kind of a blank, and I apologize.
I really enjoyed for a long time Ken Murray's Training at the Speed of Light, for example.
Yes.
It's such I can look at it and I can wow. And also recently Jeff Quayle and Terry Wollett I think did a good job reality-based training with introducing all kind of concepts.
I have been watching Jeff's interviews as of late, and both the one on responding to knife attacks as well as gun sparring piqued my interest. So the gun sparring class he put on at ILETA was one of my absolutely must go to classes.
It's so great.
Yeah, and then as far as Ken Murray's, if you are doing reality-based training, if you have not read and are not abiding by what Ken Murray says, you're behind the curve. I know when I started as an instructor, they were already using simulation. So when I moved in, what did I do? Like most instructors, I watched the people ahead of me and I copied what they did the way they did it. Well, then the question has to be is, what was their training? And the answer is they didn't have any. Best guess. Okay, guns, they go bang. All right, we'll just throw people into a scenario and we'll kind of see what happens. You know, do we have an objective? Do we understand how to best train people? Do we understand how to make people coming out of here feeling like a winner, like they're being successful? Yeah. Are we ingraining a positive response that we want to see in the field? Or are we stopping it when they've done something negative and saying, don't do that again, not understanding that when it comes time to do it again, they're not going to remember your words. They're going to remember their actions, which may lead them to doing an incorrect, less than optimal choice in those situations. And you've interviewed Ken, and that's a guy I could sit and listen to for hours because it's like a very deep well of knowledge, which, and I've had an opportunity to sit down and have a couple of conversations with him over the years, is I don't think I've even touched the top 2 inches of the well with what he knows.
Great. I asked him when part 2 comes out. He's thinking about it.
Yes, that's a book I want to see.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the first part. Can I show you 1 minute my screen, because the next part is going about ODA-approved training, and I wanted to show you the ODA loop, if the ODA cycle as I'm using it, and maybe you can comment on that if that's what we are going to talk about. I'm not sure if what are you seeing now?
Nothing yet.
Okay.
Yep, there you go. That's the one I'm talking about.
That's the one. Okay, great. So next time we're talking about ODA loop. I called it many years ago. I tried to call it ODA cycle proof training, and I have to admit people were very enthusiastic about it, because at one hand it's a very complex cycle, as you talk about, but at the same time it's also it's also a kind of, how do you call it, digestible, if you
I think you can dive as deep into it as you want to.
Yeah,
I think for the average line officer, a surface understanding of it is good. As a trainer, because I like to use it as an example of of what I need to do in order to train people, or how I would evaluate a use of force. Um, and I want to have that deeper level of knowledge and understanding of it. Quite honestly, here in the US, most people have never seen this model. They've seen the circle. And I have to admit, up until maybe 8 or 10 years ago, I had never seen this. I'd only seen the simple circle
yeah,
and how it was explained to me. And when I looked at that, I went, wait a minute, there's a whole lot more to that.
yeah,
And the longer that I've looked at it, the deeper it becomes.
yeah,
I mean, if you look at genetic heritage,
yeah,
that's all of the human factors encompassed in that one thing.
yeah,
All the research,
yeah.
all the effects of stress, attention, ability, uh, decision making, it's all right there. And so as trainers, we need to take that into account.
So, what are we going to talk about next time? What will be a nice way of tackling
Well,
this
I
model?
think if we take a look at the OODA loop from the concept, from a trainer's perspective of what it is we need to work on in those areas, uh, in order to improve what we do, in order to improve our students. Uh, if you ask if you look at the OODA loop itself, the circle, and you ask somebody, what's the most important part, they'll tell you it's observation. Well, Boyd didn't agree with that. If you look at the cycle here, and I refer to one as the loop and the other one as the cycle, if you look at the cycle, there's a whole lot more to the orientation. Why? Because to Boyd and to me and to any trainer, that is the most important part. Because number one, orientation is the individual that you're teaching,
Yeah,
the individual that you're training. Your job is to change their orientation in order to be the most effective, efficient police officer that they can be. So our job as trainers on a daily basis is to affect orientation
yeah.
on those levels. So I think that's absolutely critical for trainers to understand.
Well, I'm looking forward to our next discussion about that. And
Oh my.
thank you so much for your time right now. And I
Thank you, Eric.
really, yeah,
I have a question for you before I go.
yeah.
When are we going to get you to come to Aelita?
That's a good question. Not this week because I just had hip surgery.
Okay.
Yeah, but I would love to. Yeah, I would love it. Yeah,
We'd love to have you.
yeah. Thank you so much.
Not a problem.
Well, have a nice day, sir, and we will meet soon. I will end this podcast and say goodbye off the record. So thank you for listening. I really enjoyed it, and we're coming back with ODA-proof training. So till next time.